And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you been wanting a version of Drupal that can use workspaces, recipes, and single directory components while running all the latest versions of its underlying technologies? Drupal 11 is all of that and more. It was tagged on August 2nd by Catch of Tag 1 and 3rd and Grove, and it by design has sort of limited additional features if you're comparing it to something like Drupal 10.3 that was released really about a month ago. By design to sort of make that transition from Drupal 10 to 11 easier. Now that said, I'm pretty sure there are a variety of improvements, particularly in things like the recipes API, considering that it is sort of an experimental API, and also changes to the recipes API shouldn't have any impact on sites that have already applied recipes. That being said, we can compare some of the features that are built into Drupal 11 to what some people might be familiar with from like the initial release of Drupal 10. So certainly workspaces is a really huge feature, and I think an exciting improvement in sort of modern Drupal. I know you don't like that, Ivan, or even. Revisions and workflow are also now possible for in the UI for blocks and taxonomy terms. And there are also a variety of UI updates for creating and reusing fields, as well as for making bulk content operations. There's also a new access policy API, as well as single directory components. And there are also new navigation and announcements feeds module, as well as a variety of sort of smaller improvements for things like performance, overall usability, developer experience, and more. There is also, in terms of contrib support for Drupal 11, already about 2/3 of the top 200 modules already support Drupal 11. And then if you expand that to include modules that Rector estimates will only need info.yaml or automated bug fixes, that brings us to over 80% of the top 200, or about 75% of all the Drupal 10 compatible projects on Drupal.org, which is a pretty massive figure when you start to think about, that brings us up to I think somewhere over 7,000 different modules that are basically usable on Drupal 11 already. In terms of the updated dependencies, Drupal 11 requires PHP 8.3, uses Symfony 7.1, CKEditor 42.0.2, Twig 3.9, Yarn 4, modern versions of jQuery, jQuery UI, and a variety of others. Drupal 11 also further extends that initiative of smaller core by moving a number of modules out into the contrib space. So Actions UI, Activity Tracker, Book Forum, Statistics, and Tour. And it's also worth adding that Drupal 10 will continue to receive maintenance support until mid-2026. So the community created this version of Drupal 11 early to give sites as much time as possible to make the transition. In this case, almost 2 years, which when you think about it is, almost twice the amount of, runway that Drupal 9 sites had to get updated to Drupal 10. So let's talk about Drupal 11.
And Martin, thank you for letting me know that I don't have to upgrade my Drupal 10 site until January or February of 2026. That's perfect.
I feel like you should just go ahead and do it. Go for it.
I don't worry.
I think that was facetious of you.
I'm going to, but I know that there are some folks in the community that like to wait until the last minute. So I was actually very interested at how fast workspaces kind of got stable and got into Drupal, because admittedly, the last time I used workspaces, which may or may not have been about a year ago now, maybe a little longer, it had some issues. So happy to see that it's made it into Drupal core. I look forward to seeing more people being able to use that and to kind of see use cases for that and discussions about it, because I think that's an interesting feature.
I agree. And I know there is a project called Workspaces Extra. I think it was mentioned on the show a few episodes back. But hopefully, with it being stable, as you say, more people will start to use it, and we'll start to see a little bit more of an ecosystem grow up around it as well.
I think it's always an interesting conversation briefly to talk about the fact that we really need to get rid of versioning. This is now the latest version of Drupal, and if you're on Drupal 10, you're on an old version of Drupal. And I believe, thank you, Ivan, because I believe, Ivan, you care deeply about this too, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Keep talking. Keep talking. Say more. Say more.
We'll put a link in the show notes to our episode on this topic.
Yeah, there's a whole episode on this, and there probably should be more, because honestly, we want to get so comfortable with these upgrades and these deprecations that it's just part of a typical release cycle. Like every twice a year, you're just updating your site. And we have 20 Drupal sites at Urban Institute. And there's currently only 2 that are on Drupal 7, and everything else is on the latest version of Drupal 10 as of 6 months ago. We're all 10.2 or 10.1, 10.2. But once we hit 10.3, which is not a significant change from 10.3 to 11, it's basically the same, just the latest release. And just with deprecation and some updates. And there's always a little bit of growing pains there to go to a new major version, but I'm actually already looking forward to 11.1 to see some of this new stuff really start to take off. But anyway, I find it fascinating with the version numbers.
I do too. And I was just about to say that we are now experimenting with actually putting in our contracts major version updates as just part of the deal. So starting in January, if you're a 10.7 client, and there's a major version update, we're not going to charge you extra. We're not going to have a capital expenditure. It's just going to be part of the regular set of updates. That's my hope as the CEO. That's my goal. We'll see how the next 6 months evolve with how 11 rolls out, with the kinds of things that we see. But that's where I want to get to for 2025.
So I wanna take a minute to dig into that just a second, right?
Sure.
So the goal there is that, like, you have a standard maintenance agreement with a client, and upgrading to new versions of Drupal is just kind of like standard practice, right? And I'm assuming there would be like a change order or maybe some additional cost if there was some custom bits of a customer's code that needed to be updated to be part of that, or to be useful on that version. Is that the thinking?
Yes. So our 10.7 care contracts right now include updates to the latest major version that you're on. So if you're on 10, we'll make sure you're on 10.1, 10.2, 10.3. Those are zero cost except for the maintenance contract. My hope is that I can add to that and have it not mention version. It's just the latest major version, and there's no additional expenditure. We had to have additional expenditure for upgrades from Drupal 8 to Drupal 10, but I mean that's the way the cookie crumbles. But from next year onwards, my hope is that it's just Drupal. It's the latest version. No additional expenditure needed. If there's custom code, yes, there's always some edge case somewhere. But if we've been maintaining the site for the last 3-5 years, that custom code isn't even going to be an issue really going from 10 to 11. Honestly, like, it's not a 7 to 8 or an 8 to 11. Like, it's 10 to 11.
Yeah, and you can build in hours for that into the maintenance agreement, right? So the
Of course.
other thing here I wanna highlight is smaller core, because I'm a huge fan of smaller core, right? Wondering how anybody feels about that list of modules. I'll say it again just so everybody remembers: Action UI, Activity Tracker, Book, Forum, Statistics, Tour, going into the contrib space. Like, Book, to me, I'm kind of like, bye. See you guys later.
Huge success. Book was always such a big challenge for people to maintain in core, and it could have been so much more outside of core. I feel like almost every one of these modules has a better alternative in contrib, or if it doesn't, it should. Like Forum probably doesn't have a good alternative that I'm aware of, but that for the concept of Forum, I would love to see comments do this too, but I don't know if that'll ever happen. But the concept of Forum and Statistics and Tour, I just feel lives better out in contrib space where it could iterate even further or potentially not iterate and have lived its life well. But most of these are like classic modules, like been there since the very beginning.
It's funny.
Yeah,
I'm like thinking now about like, well, should comment be a contrib module? I'm like, could that come out of core? And then I'm like, well, blog posts, some cases still need comments.
But think about it. If you're implementing comments nowadays, do you use the comment module or do you use a service?
I mean, I usually advise to use a service, but
Yeah.
I mean, I can see
Spam
I
is
can
too
see
hard.
a use case. I can see a use case for using core
Well,
comments.
we dropped comments on the Talking Drupal website when we upgraded to Drupal 10 because we had 450,000 unmoderated comments on the Drupal 7 site.
Wow.
We didn't
Well,
realize.
but let's be realistic here. That was more because we might not have had the proper process or the proper precautions in place to
Exactly.
to support that, right? But like, I think there is a place where if you have a blog and commenting is a thing that you need to do, like having that functionality in core seems a little bit easier than having to go like find it and implement it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it'll be interesting to see. I know one of the work tracks for Starshot is to have sort of a more modern blog set up. And it'll be interesting to see whether, core comments are part of that. If so, what security measures do they have? Or do they look at more of an integration with some kind of a third-party service? So
I will say, Martin, you raise, whether you intended to or not, you raise an interesting thought there, right? Is that we may start to see a shift to more smaller core and more things being shipped out of core with the advent of recipes, right? Because if I'm like, oh, I need a blog, and I go to implement the blog recipe, and the blog recipe includes comments, and it pulls it from a contrib space as opposed to a core space, like, I'm not going to really care, right? I'm going to have commenting, and I'm going to have commenting the way that, the Drupal community feels like it should be. So, I think we may see in future versions more things going out to the contrib space and recipes just being like, I could see a day where, there's a recipe installer, right? And you just hit the button and it installs the recipe and gets all the stuff from wherever, right? So the idea of like core could be very different.
There is a recipe installer today, John. It's called Project Browser.
As soon as I said that, I was like, somebody's going to have something to say here because I'm pretty sure that this already exists. So, Martin, thank you for that correction. And yes, Project Browser does now support recipes, as Martin indicated, which is fabulous.
So, Martin, if our listeners wanted to suggest a module of the week or a core upgrade of their own, what would be the best way for them to do that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.